Hello, I'm Monsignor Jim Lisante. Today on Personally Speaking, I'll be joined by British Catholic writer Austen Ivereigh, who has written a new book about Pope Francis's papacy called Wounded Shepherd. The subtitle, Pope Francis and His Struggle to Convert the Catholic Church. Please stay with us. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Monsignor Jim Lisante, and British Catholic writer, journalist, and commentator Austen Ivereigh joins me now. Austen is one of the leading interpreters of Pope Francis's papacy and is known for his best-selling authoritative biography called The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope. His new book is called Wounded Shepherd, Pope Francis and His Struggle to Convert the Catholic Church. It's an account and analysis of the often turbulent reform led by history's first Jesuit and Latin American Pope, Pope Francis. The book is the result of 3 years of research in Rome, Latin America, and the United States, interviews with key players in the Francis pontificate, as well as meetings with the Pope himself. Austen Ivereigh is a fellow in contemporary church history at the Jesuit-run Campion Hall, University of Oxford. He earned his doctorate for a thesis on the church in Argentina from another Oxford college, St. Anthony's. For many years, Austen was deputy editor of The Tablet, and he currently writes regularly for Commonweal, America Magazine, and The Tablet. He's very often well known as a commentator on the BBC. Austen and his wife Linda live on a small farm in Hereford, England, close to the Welsh border, and he's here with us today to discuss his latest book on Pope Francis. So pleased now to have us be joined and to welcome to Personally Speaking the Catholic writer and journalist, Dr. Austen Ivereigh. Many of us first learned of Austen and his wonderful writing when he wrote The Great Reformer about Pope Francis, a great biography of the man. But before we even get into specifically the book, Austen, back in 1980, I invited Cardinal Hume to come to New York to give a talk on what the disabled teach us about God. And he came and he was wonderful, brilliant, holy, kind, beautiful man. I love the guy. But I'm wondering, because timing is off, do you have any idea what Pope Francis would make of a guy like Basil Hume?
I think they would have a lot in common. I'd never thought about that before you asked me, but I think there's an awful lot there. I think that they would find in common. Both contemplatives, both I think were very human, very close to people. I think both were troubled by a certain kind of centralism out of Rome and tried to mediate that, to their local church. So yeah, I think they would have had a lot to talk about.
Now, Austen has also written other books, obviously. One of them has a great title I love, How to Defend the Church Without Raising Your Voice. We're living in an age of shouting, Austen, and you have ideas on how we might better deal with church and media. What's your great insight into that particular dynamic?
Well, it's interesting. We set up, that's to say, a colleague and I set up a project called Catholic Voices back in 2010, and that was when Benedict XVI was coming to Britain to beatify Cardinal Newman, who, of course, Pope Francis has just canonized in Rome in October. And at the time, and you'll remember this very well, particularly 2010, there was an awful lot of controversy, an awful lot of not only scandals, but also a lot of hostility towards the Church's positions, mainstream faith positions, ethical positions, particularly on things like homosexuality and abortion and so on. So we created this group called Catholic Voices to respond to some of those criticisms. So we trained some young people and for about 6 months, and then they went out on air. And anyway, it was a success, and that's what led to the book. And what we learned in those months in working through how to communicate the Church's controversial positions was had to say, well, what is it that the Church is not communicating successfully here? And almost always what we realized that the Church was failing to communicate was, if you like, the primary part, the first part, which is the love, the mercy, the unconditional acceptance, from which then flows everything else. And that somehow in journalism we say, you've buried the lead, L-E-D-E. That means the first paragraph of your story. The really important stuff, in other words, you've buried. So a lot of our training was actually about understanding that that's the most important message we needed to get out. In many ways, I think Francis has done that. I mean, Francis is probably the most successful example, I think, of what one might call that ability to communicate the heart of the gospel, which precedes everything else, and which, if you like, enables people to then embrace that. So I think it's about mercy. It's about communicating the mercy of God. It's about understanding also that a lot of the criticisms of the church often come from a value which is Christian, which people believe is threatened in some way by the church. And what you need to do is dig down into where is the breakdown between that Christian value to which they adhere and where they see the church is failing to embody it. And of course, where the church has failed to embody a Christian principle, we have to say it. We have to own it. We have to say, yeah, we got that wrong. But on the other hand, mostly it's a misunderstanding usually about what the church really teaches. So I guess it's a method which enables you to put the most important thing first and to deal with the sources of misunderstanding which exist in a modern secular society about the church.
Our guest is Austen Ivereigh. He's written a wonderful new book called Wounded Shepherd about Pope Francis and his attempts to truly convert the Catholic Church. Let me ask you, one of the things that we do in our show regularly is have people on who are not particularly religious or Catholic. In fact, I enjoy having guests who are very often agnostic, or those who say, well, I was raised Catholic, but to a person, actors, writers, directors, creative people, usually because we're in New York, will say, but I got to tell you, even though I'm not a religious person, I am mesmerized by, I love this Pope Francis of yours. And then I pick up books written by Orthodox Catholics where they seem to actively hate this guy. And I say to myself, why is it that people of still discovering faith love him, and those who are dedicated to their faith have such antipathy toward him? There's a book out there about him as dictator pope. Where does the energy come from those who dislike him so intensely that they don't see the great gift he is to the church?
Well, when I was writing Wounded Shepherd, kind of halfway through writing it, I realized that the story I was trying to tell was insufficient. In other words, I was trying to explain what it is that Francis is seeking to do in terms of what he's inviting the church to, the discernment of modernity and why the church is failing to evangelize and all that. But I realized what I had to account for was what you just talked about there, the ferocity of the opposition to this pope, coming from particularly, certain kind of middle-class educated, often American groups. I mean, not just America, but America unquestionably where it's strongest. And so I had to understand, well, what's really going on here? And I found myself and I've got many answers to this in the book, and I've got many answers now, but what I found myself was I was drawn constantly, in fact, to John's Gospel and looking at Jesus and the Pharisees. And you have to ask yourself the same question. Why is it that the very religious people in Jesus' time, one might say actually the elites of their day, the religious elites of their day, rejected Christ? They recognized in him the power. They recognized in him a great teacher, one who performed great works. And yet they felt deeply threatened by him to the point where they sought to deny, really, that he was who he was.
Right.
They sought to delegitimize him. And I think that's exactly what's going on with Francis. There is, in Francis's pontificate, there is something, a lot, which threatens certain people. And I think you have to look into what it is that Francis is doing, where the opposition is coming from, and where it appears. And the conclusion I've come to in studying the papacy for the last few years is that the opposition arises really from two moments. One is when the Pope allows the people of God to speak. So he allows, as it were, the ordinary people the protagonism to say to the church, this is what we expect of you or want of you. And the other moment is when he touches on the heart of the gospel, which is mercy, and mercy meaning the unconditional, borderless love of God for all people, which is unconditional, which is not earned or deserved. And of course, the reason that mercy is so threatening to people is that mercy, there's no reward in it, right? We can't earn it.
Right.
And therefore, that's deeply upsetting for people who actually are trying to hold on to something that they believe that they've earned. And I think we're getting close there to something of what's going on here.
We're talking with Austen Ivereigh, whose book is called Wounded Shepherd. And I know that when I go to religious ed class to talk to the kids and I say, name the sin that Jesus condemned the most in the Gospels, they guess all sorts of things that are wrong. And, of course, you and I know that it is hypocrisy, time and time again, hypocrisy. What is it in our church, do you imagine, that doesn't recognize that still our greatest sin is hypocrisy? And I think to myself, back in the 90s, I was sent around the country to explain John Paul's theology of the body. And I did it with enthusiasm because I think there's great stuff there. But at the same time, I now know that much of my church, in terms of leadership, was sometimes covering up the worst abuses of innocent young people. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, we're out there promoting this theology of the body while not respecting the bodies of these young people. Great hypocrisy. It comes up time and time again. It's probably what's behind those who attack Pope Francis. Why don't we get it, Austen, that for all of us, the great sin is hypocrisy?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things on that. One is, some people sometimes ask me, how is it that the church could have done these things? How is it that a good institution, is able to cover up terrible abuse and so on? And my response these days is, I think it's a mistake to think of the church as a good institution. It's a bit like when Jesus says only God is good.
Right.
Really, the church is a tempted institution. It's a place of spiritual combat. Where you find great goodness, where you find the Holy Spirit and grace, you will always find the opposite. So that's one point to make. About that there is a struggle involved. That the church is an attacked institution. So understanding there's a combat there. And then the other thing I think is to understand what Jesus meant by hypocrisy. Hypocrisy wasn't people who failed to live up to the demands, of Christianity, of a faith. Well, if that's the definition of hypocrisy, we're all hypocrites.
Right.
In fact, Jesus' message is precisely directed at those who fall in that gap, as we all do. No, what he meant by hypocrisy was the kind of Greek sense of hypokrites, meaning a mask that you put on. You perform a role, and then you take it off at the end of the day, a bit like sort of taking off your tie when you come back from work, and then, having been an upright person during the day, you then behave however you want in the evening. And that's what we're dealing with here, isn't it? With a lot of what might call the kind of the clerical hypocrisy involved in the abuse scandal and so on. So what's going on in that hypocrisy? Well, it's people who have ceased to put Christ at the center. They're actually attached to other things. In the case of clergy, it's a role which they fulfill, which gives them power, which gives them authority, and they use that not for the good of the poor and the vulnerable, but rather for their own benefit and their own satisfaction.
Yeah,
Cardinal Bergoglio used to, when he was Cardinal, Pope Francis used to talk a lot to his priests about the difference between a mediator and an intermediary. I really like this. So a mediator is somebody who brings together two people, and if you like, sacrifices himself for the sake of that relationship. I mean, a good priest, a great pastor, is really a mediator between, us and God and so on. And an intermediary is somebody who brings two people together like a middleman, and then benefits at the expense of both sides. And I think that's a lot of what Francis has been seeking to combat in the church, and in Rome in particular, is that intermediary culture, which is really a worldly, hypocritical kind of looking at the gifts of the church not as gifts for the sake of the people, but rather things that I can use for my own benefit.
We are here talking to the author Austen Ivereigh about his book Wounded Shepherd. As I mentioned, the subtitle, Pope Francis and His Struggle to Convert the Catholic Church. I come from an Italian father, Irish mother. I mention that because I guess the Italian side says, don't cross me because you're going to find I'm willing to fight. I mention that in the context of this question, Austen. And you talk about it in your book, what people like Cardinal Burke do to our Pope, what people like Archbishop Vigano do to our Pope in terms of vilifying him. I'm thinking I've lived long enough to know that in the time of Pope John Paul II, these kinds of people attacking the Pope would have either been silenced or removed. So my question, maybe the Italian side of my nature asks this, but why doesn't Francis take these people and give them a what for?
How is that the Italian side?
Well, because don't cross us. We're
Right, I'm with you. Okay, I got you. Yeah. Right. In the sense of the Irishman, Scorsese's The Irishman or The Godfather, I'm with you. Yeah. Well, it's a continued mystery to me that the opposition to Francis constantly lists a kind of set of grievances, and they describe Francis as some kind of authoritarian, dictatorial type. As you said, there's even a book called The Dictator Pope. And yet, he, and I say in the book, he generally leaves in place the people who oppose him. I mean, he doesn't generally sack them. He himself says, I don't like to cut off heads. He's happy to have a certain degree of attention and opposition and so on. So yeah, I mean, now I do say in the book that in the case of Cardinal Burke, he did remove him from the kind of the highest court in Rome,
right?
Because Cardinal Burke opposed vital reforms to the annulment system, which the bishops wanted and the bishops had backed, and therefore he had to remove him because he would have been an obstacle. But generally, where people are not an obstacle to the mission, to what the Pope is seeking to do, he generally leaves them in place to a remarkable degree, I think. I say in the book that in Rome, he has changed after 6 years many fewer heads of the departments of the Vatican than his two predecessors had at the same time in their pontificates. And so it's just simply a myth to make out that Francis is in some way dictatorial or authoritarian. I think quite the opposite.
Right. We're talking here with Austen Ivereigh about his book, The Wounded Shepherd. Let me ask you, many of the people who write about you, Austen, will say that this man, this author, enjoys, I love this expression, unprecedented access to the Holy Father. Now, I ask you, why you?
Well, okay, so I mean, but this is part of the myth that grows up, about... So, I remember a bishop saying to me, after The Great Reformer, my biography, which came out at the end of 2014, I remember him saying to me, you who know Pope Francis really well, and I had to say to him, I've never met him. When I wrote the biography, I had literally never met him, never had any time with him, except briefly in the square, like everybody else. I shook his hand. So no, I have since had much more contact with him, and I describe at the beginning of the book how I had a remarkable sit-down meeting with him last year for 45 minutes. But that was the only time we've ever had a sort of proper meeting, an audience, you would call it. Apart from, we obviously bumped into each other on many occasions, and and we've had a few minutes to speak here and there. Now, it's true that I have had some access to people close to him who have been very helpful to me in explaining how the Pope thinks. And I've often gone to them and said, look, can you explain this and, what's going on here? And that definitely has been very helpful for the book. I don't think he has, given anybody particularly permission to do that. But I think there is a certain trust of me because of the biography.
Right.
Because I really did try to go understand the origins of his thinking. And I do know about Argentina, one of my sort of great examples of providence in life is that 25 years ago I did a PhD on the church in Argentina. So I'm proof, I say this in universities, I'm proof sometimes PhDs can be useful, even though you might have to wait 20 years to find out how. But I was in an unusual position to be able to go back into some of his past and the context out of which he came. And I think it's that sort of empathy and understanding of his background which has, I think, led people around him perhaps to say, well, he knows what he's talking about, and we can assume he won't misuse this or misunderstand this, maybe.
Right. Austen, you raised in the whole question of getting access to the Holy Father something that puts in my mind someone else. Father James Martin, Jesuit, has written about the Church's outreach to the gay community and about being more accepting, embracing, respectful of. That would be fine. He's gotten beaten up for it by people who are very strongly conservative in the Church. But I mention Jim Martin because the Holy Father didn't have to give him a personal meeting recently, but he did. And he had to know, when I meet with Father James Martin, who is a gasoline to fire for a lot of these arch-conservatives, it's going to get them all riled up. Do you think he has meetings like that on purpose to say, hey, I'm okay with this guy trying to be more loving and tolerant and accepting of people in the gay community?
I absolutely do. I mean, I don't think that Francis held what was actually a very public meeting. See, the significance of that meeting with Jim Martin was that they met in the Apostolic Palace, which is where dignitaries are received, where heads of state and so on. And there's an official photograph of the two at the desk together, which is the typical photograph of those heads of state meetings. So that was the importance of the symbolic importance of it. Was that picture, that moment. And I actually do think Francis was saying with that, this man's ministry is important. This man is evangelizing. This man is communicating the gospel, which he is. Jim's a great friend, and he tells me that he goes to these, he goes to give talks. And actually, the substance of what he has to say is just pure gospel. It's about what I was saying earlier. It's about the unconditional love of God for all his creatures, however they are. That's the place we start from. And he has people coming up to him at the end of these meetings and hugging him and crying and saying, this is the first time in my life I felt love from the church and all this. And then he goes outside, and there are people with placards, denouncing him as a heretic. And then you have to say, well, there's something important going on here spiritually. And you have to say, well, this is the dynamic of the gospel, And I think the Pope totally gets that, totally recognizes that. Jim is a faithful Jesuit priest who has never, and never would, question, church teaching and so on, but rather seeks to do what I was talking about earlier, to bring up to talk about the thing that gets forgotten in the church's proclamation on sexuality. And that's what he sought to emphasize, and that's what the Pope really, I think, was endorsing there.
This may be off the topic, but on Austen Ivereigh, who's written this wonderful book called Wounded Shepherd, lives a normal life apart from his writing times. I got to ask you, every Sunday or every weekend I do weddings, Austen. One of the ways I prepare is to give a good homily. I ask the couples to write me an essay. Why, of the billion people out there they might have chosen, why is this the one? So I got to ask you, Austen Ivereigh, why is Linda the one for you?
Oh, wow. Wow, gosh. Now, there's a question I wasn't expecting. We met in London. I now live actually in the country near the Welsh border on a farm. But we met in London, and we were both in the same parish. And she lived on my street, and it was a bit of a joke among my friends because I used to travel a lot to Latin America and so on. And that after years of traveling around the world, I married a girl on my street. And in fact, we got married just further up the street at the parish. So, no, she was the one for me, I guess, because it was a particular time of my life when I think I was ready to make that commitment. And that makes it sound like who it was didn't matter, but actually I think it was the combination of who she was and very caring, and at a time I think when I was able to respond to that. But more importantly, I'd been through enough that I was capable of making that commitment, which I think I'd found harder to do earlier.
Might be a harder question, but any ideas why Linda chose Austen?
Yeah, well, she, and this is often true, isn't it? People that marry, she had said, I've given up on men, they're useless. In other words, she wasn't looking. And actually, nor was I. In fact, what brought us together were her dogs. We went walking her dogs on Christmas Day in Hyde Park one year. That's what sealed the deal. My advice to single people is always get a dog. Well, at least in England, because generally in the UK, strangers don't talk to each other unless they have dogs, in which case they treat each other like long lost friends.
The dogs brought everybody together. That's beautiful. In his book Wounded Shepherd, Austen Ivereigh spends a good deal of time on the debate within the church about those who are married, divorced, remarried, and receiving communion. And here's my question for you, Austen. I've never gotten my head around or gotten past understanding how if Jesus is at the Last Supper with these 12, who he knows in short order will desert him, deny him, not have the courage to stand by him, not be at the foot of the cross like his mother, and he gives communion to them nonetheless, knowing that they're sinners. How in the world how we come to this point where we use the Eucharist as a litmus test on who is or who is not a good enough Catholic to receive? Yeah,
and I think, it was Cardinal Martini, wasn't it, who famously said that the Eucharist is not a reward for the righteous, but medicine for the sick.
Right.
And that's the point, is, when we start to use, not just the Eucharist, but when we start to use things like Christian orthodoxy or membership of the church as a way of defining ourselves against others, then we're in trouble. We've fallen into the Pharisaical kind of mindset. The great mistake in a way, the great betrayal of Israel was that they failed to universalize God's love, which was their mission. And our mission as Christians is always to proclaim that universality of that love, because ultimately, we only change when we're loved, and the great message of the Incarnation is that God so wants us to change, so wants to save us, so wants us that he starts, by not giving us a lecture or a moral law, or he doesn't write a book even. Imagine, he doesn't write a book. He sends his son, and that son takes on a form of a culture and a language and a family in a poor place. That's how much, God seeks to save us, and how God seeks to save us. And so much of, I think, what Francis has been seeking to do, and I hope I've communicated this in the book, is, if you like, getting the church's message and its method to cohere, to be the same thing. And, I talk in the book, and I use a complicated Greek word, and I only use it a lot because he does, and he used it when we were together last year. And that word in Greek is synktakabasis. I don't know whether I pronounced it properly. But it's the coming down and to come close of God. It's that action of coming down to come close. Everything starts with that.
Right.
And that's when the church is most successful at evangelizing. It is when it does that. It is when it performs the God that it proclaims. And that's why mercy is so much at the heart of this pontificate. And I talked there about the three in one of the chapters, about the three stages of mercy that begins with this coming down to come close, and then there's a second stage of accompanying and responding concretely to people's needs, and then a third stage of conversion and integration. So that when the church is merciful, when it performs, if you like, those stages, it is doing what God does to us, so that when people experience the church that way, they are actually genuinely experiencing God. That is an encounter with Christ. And, Christianity, and this is a big theme of the book, and for Francis, it begins, Benedict said it so well in Deus Caritas Est, the Christianity begins not with an idea, not with an ethical proposition, but with the encounter with a person who changes your horizon. Christianity is an experience, and therefore the church has to learn to offer that experience, and insofar as it does, then it evangelizes. So a big part of the book is kind of understanding why Bergoglio in Latin America and the Latin American church looked at Europe and the United States, and they said, you know what, the church is failing to evangelize because it stopped doing that thing that enabled the church to spread like wildfire in the first centuries. So I think that's what it's about. It's about helping the church to become, if you like, more like the God it proclaims.
I'd like to thank Austen Ivereigh for being a guest on Personally Speaking. I think, like many other people, I first discovered him through The Great Reformer, wonderful book on Francis. Now this new book, Wounded Shepherd, subtitled Pope Francis and His Struggle to Convert the Catholic Church, is so good. What Austen does is take what Francis is thinking, feeling, attempting to do, and I find it eminently readable. And I think for a lot of us, to fully understand Francis, we need someone who can walk us through in a real, down-to-earth way, and Austen does that. It takes theological concept and makes it understandable for us regular guys. And I appreciate so much his gift for writing and his insights into what Francis is trying to accomplish. Austen, keep on keeping on, and thank you so much for everything you've done so far to help us better understand this complex, wonderful gift to the Church called Pope Francis.
Thank you for the gift of letting me be on your program, Monsignor. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, Austen. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
As we end today's program, I want to thank you all for being with us. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can send them to me through our website. That is www.closeencountertv.com. Again, www.closeencountertv.com. Or if you want to listen to past Personally Speaking episodes, go to the same website. Just click on the radio button at the top of the page. Please be sure to visit that site and encourage others to do the same. And you can also listen to past Personally Speaking episodes by going to www.ollmp.org. Again, www.ollmp.org. And you'll not only get the show, but you'll get weekly homilies by Monsignor Jim Lisante. I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer of Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Jandovitz on Personally Speaking.